something here. It's alive. We're not dead.
It came for us.
Elira awoke to the sound of something scratching at the window. A slow, deliberate noise like claws raking against the glass. She lay still, barely breathing, her body tensed beneath the covers. The night outside was thick with fog, muting the streetlights and shrouding the world in an eerie stillness. The scratching came again, but when she turned her head, there was nothing there. She exhaled slowly. It's nothing, just the wind or the dry branches of the old elm tree swaying against the house, yet a lingering unease curled in her stomach, a feeling she couldn't shake. Callum stirred beside her, shifting under the blankets. His breathing was slow and deep, almost too deep, as if he weren't truly asleep but waiting. Elira reached for his hand beneath the covers, feeling the familiar warmth of his skin. That simple contact grounded her, made her feel safe, though the unease never fully faded. Lately, something had been off. It was in the way Callum moved, the way his eyes lingered a moment too long, studying her when he thought she wasn't looking. It was the way his wounds healed too fast, tiny cuts sealing themselves in minutes, bruises vanishing overnight. She had seen him slice his palm on a kitchen knife last week, the skin splitting open like ripe fruit, dark blood welling. She had turned to grab a towel, but when she looked back, the wound was already closing, the flesh knitting together unnaturally fast. "Callum," she had whispered, watching him flex his fingers as if nothing had happened. "How did you—" He had just smiled, shaking his head. "Guess I got lucky." Lucky. She had let it go at the time, forcing herself to believe it was just a trick of the light, that she had imagined it. But it was happening too often now, these little things she had started keeping track of in the back of her mind. And then there were the disappearances. People in town were vanishing. It started small. A man from the gas station never showed up to work. An elderly woman's house left empty, her front door hanging open, the smell of her cooking still fresh in the air. Then it escalated. Families went missing overnight, their beds unmade, their belongings undisturbed. No signs of struggle, no blood, no bodies. The police found what remained of a few victims last week, though she wished they hadn't. Twisted shapes of flesh fused together in ways that defied nature, bones bent at impossible angles. It made her stomach turn. The news had no explanation. Theories spread. Wild animals, a serial killer, a cult. None of them made sense. Elira had lived on Earth long enough to recognize human fear. But this was something different. And tonight, that something felt closer than ever. She turned away from the window, nestling against Callum's warmth. He didn't react, his breathing still too slow, too deep. The room was too quiet. Not just the house, but the outside, the entire town wrapped in unnatural silence. No wind, no rustling trees, no distant hum of cars. Her skin prickled, her senses sharpening. Something was watching them. The feeling was subtle, like a whisper against the edge of her mind. It wasn't human. She knew that instinctively. It was something else, something old, something patient. She resisted the urge to look back at the window. Callum shifted, inhaling sharply, his body rigid for a moment before he relaxed again. Her unease deepened. She had never questioned what he was, never had a reason to. She had lived among humans long enough to understand them, to mimic them, blend in. She knew their habits, their fragility. She knew their limits, and Callum was breaking them. She thought back to their first meeting years ago, how he had been different from the others, how his presence had soothed something raw inside her, something she hadn't realized was wounded. He had been her anchor, her constant, the reason she had stayed on this planet instead of moving on. But now, for the first time, she felt something else when she looked at him. Doubt. The scratching sound returned, louder this time, a slow, deliberate drag against the glass. Elira's breath caught in her throat. She knew she should turn, should look, but her instincts screamed against it. Then a click. Software subtle, organic. Her blood ran cold. It was a sound she hadn't heard in years, not since she had left her homeworld, not since her people had disappeared. Her heart pounded. She turned her head, forcing herself to look. The window was empty, just the thick fog beyond, but her reflection, her own face, was wrong. Her reflection was staring back at her, and it was smiling. Elira couldn't sleep, not after what she had seen. The reflection that had stared back at her, her own face, smiling when she wasn't. It wasn't possible. It had to be a trick of the light, a moment of exhaustion warping her vision. But deep inside, she knew better. It was real, and it meant something was terribly, terribly wrong. Callum hadn't noticed anything, or if he hadn't reacted. He had simply exhaled, turned over, and fallen into the heavy, unnatural sleep that had become too common for him. Elira had lain beside him, rigid, staring at the ceiling until the weight of her thoughts became unbearable. She needed answers. Slipping from the bed, she moved soundlessly, listening to the unnatural silence of the house. It felt different tonight, like something beneath the walls was holding its breath. The basement door stood at the end of the hallway. It was always locked. Callum had never let her inside. She had never pushed before. Tonight, she did. The handle was slick, almost damp beneath her fingers. She turned it slowly, expecting resistance, expecting the lock to hold firm. But it didn't. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. Elira hesitated. The air smelled strange, metallic and wet, thick with something deeper than dust. The scent clung to her, coiling in her lungs, triggering instincts long buried. A part of her, the part that still belonged to the stars, to her lost people, whispered to turn back. She stepped inside. The basement was cold, the air dense, pressing against her skin as if something unseen lurked just beyond the edges of the light. The steps groaned beneath her weight, her bare feet silent against the wood. The moment she reached the bottom, she felt it. Something was alive down here. The walls were damp. Pipes ran along the ceiling, but they weren't normal. They pulsed. The longer she stared, the more they seemed wrong, their surfaces too smooth, too organic. Something thick and dark trickled along their edges, dripping onto the floor in slow, viscous beads. Her stomach twisted. In the center of the room stood a table. On it, scattered in neat, almost surgical precision, lay remnants of something. Torn flesh, not human, not animal. Chunks of skin, some too thick, others too translucent, their textures shifting as though they had once been alive. And then, bones, not shaped like any creature on Earth, elongated, twisted, as if something had been growing in the wrong direction. Some of them looked melted, fused together in unnatural formations. She had seen something like this before. Back home. Elira reached for one of the bones, her fingers brushing against its surface, only to recoil instantly. The bone was warm, a breath, not hers. She whirled around. Callum stood at the top of the stairs, his face cast in shadow. His eyes gleamed in the dim light, catching something wet, something inhuman. "You weren't supposed to see this," he said, his voice steady but wrong. Elira took a step back, her pulse hammering in her throat. "What is this, Callum?" For a moment he didn't move. Then he exhaled, stepping forward into the dim light, and she saw it. His skin, always too smooth, always too perfect, was moving. Tiny shifts beneath the surface, rippling as if something inside him was restless. His veins pulsed, not with blood, but with something darker, something viscous and unnatural. His hands clenched at his sides, the fingers slightly too long, too tense. "I wanted to tell you," he said softly. "I just didn't know how." Elira couldn't speak, because she was staring at his arm. A seam had formed along his forearm, a line that split open, flesh parting in an unnatural slit. And from within, something stirred. Not bone, not muscle, something alive. A second set of fingers flexed within his arm, something vestigial, hidden beneath his skin all this time, something not human. Her stomach twisted. Callum inhaled sharply, his body tensing, fighting something unseen. The movement beneath his skin stilled, as though forced back into hiding. "You're not human," she whispered. His expression darkened. "And neither are you." Elira's breath caught. He took another step forward, the basement shifting around them, the pipes above groaning as if something larger was pressing against them. "I don't know what I am," he admitted. "Not fully, but I know they're coming." Elira's spine went rigid. The scratching at the window, the town's disappearances, the feeling of being watched. It wasn't just paranoia. Something was coming. And Callum, whatever he was the only thing standing between them and whatever was lurking in the dark. The walls were breathing. Elira felt it before she saw it. The slow, rhythmic expansion, the damp exhale of something vast and unseen pressing against the very structure of their home. The basement's air thickened with an odor so pungent it clung to her tongue, a mix of decay and raw, wet earth. Callum stood in the dim light, his body tense, his jaw clenched so tightly she thought his teeth might crack. The unnatural seam in his arm had sealed itself, the writhing mass beneath his skin retreating. But she had seen it. She knew now. He was not what she thought. But neither was this house. Something wet dripped onto her shoulder. Elira barely had time to react before the ceiling split open above them. The plaster, the wooden beams, all of it, peeled back like rotting flesh, revealing something beneath. Something alive. A gaping wound of a mouth lined with tendrils of raw, pulsing muscle quivered in the open ceiling, stretching wide, revealing a hollow void of flesh and bone. Elira staggered back as something moved inside it, something large, something ancient. The house wasn't a house anymore. It had never been. Callum exhaled sharply, his hands clenching at his sides as his body trembled, his skin shifting again, the rippling mass inside him fighting to be freed. "It's waking up," he said through gritted teeth. "It knows we're here." Elira's breath hitched. The Devourer. She had heard the name before. A whisper passed through her people before their extinction. A creature, not a single entity, but a force, a thing that did not kill, did not destroy in the way humans feared. It absorbed, it consumed. And now, she realized with a deep, bone-chilling certainty, it had never left. The town, the disappearances, the grotesque remains left behind. It wasn't a predator hunting them, it was eating them. And she and Callum were standing inside its belly. The floorboards warped beneath her feet, the wood twisting as though it were liquid, veins of dark, glistening tissue writhing just below the surface. A groaning, shuddering sound filled the air, a noise too low, too deep for any living thing to make. Yet it vibrated in her bones, pressed against her skull like a voice with no words. It was speaking, and it was hungry. Callum lunged, grabbing her wrist just as the ground collapsed beneath them. The wood shattered, but there was no basement below anymore, only a gaping abyss of wet, undulating flesh, tendrils snapping forward like the inside of a creature's gut. They fell. Elira hit the ground hard, her knees slamming into something warm, something moving. Callum landed beside her in a crouch, his breath ragged, his body changing. She watched in horror as his back arched unnaturally, the skin along his spine splitting in jagged lines. Something pushed free, long skeletal ridges, shifting plates of dark bone, alien and grotesque, emerging from beneath his skin. His breath came in short, broken gasps, his fingers digging into the fleshy ground. She started, but her voice vanished as the world around them shuddered. A sound like wet meat tearing echoed through the massive chamber. Elira's stomach twisted as she turned her head, and she saw it. The Devourer was fully awake. It had no form, not in the way a creature should. It was part of the house, part of the town, part of everything. A vast, shifting thing, a mass of flesh, of bone, of pulsating veins, twisting and folding into grotesque, ever-changing configurations. Eyes bloomed along its surface, opening and closing in unnatural patterns, some too large, others tiny and malformed. And then came the mouths, thousands of them, each one twisted, deformed, lined with jagged, writhing teeth. And they were hungry. Elira's instincts screamed at her to run, but the ground beneath her buckled, dragging her forward, the wet flesh pulling her toward the nearest gaping maw. She clawed at the surface, her fingers sinking into pulsating muscle, her skin burning where it touched the thing's shifting tissue. Callum moved, not as a man, not as a human, but as something else. His body contorted in ways that should not be possible, his bones snapping into new alignments, his arms lengthening, talons emerging where fingers had been. His breath hitched, his teeth sharpening in his mouth as he turned his gaze toward her. He was fighting it, fighting what he was. But for how much longer? The Devourer's mouth screamed, a sound that shattered every nerve in her body, vibrating through her skull like a shriek from something not meant to exist. And then it lunged. Elira had only seconds to act. She knew the Devourer could not be fought like a beast. It wasn't a beast. It was something more, something ancient, something eternal. And if it had survived this long, what would it take to kill it? The Devourer's voices were everywhere now, thousands of mouths whispering, shrieking, laughing. The sound burrowed into Elira's skull, twisting inside her brain like living wires, threading through her thoughts, filling them with hunger. It was no longer just speaking to her. It was calling her. The ground beneath her was alive, shifting like muscle and sinew, a vast body stretching beyond the edges of reality itself. Walls of writhing flesh pulsed around them, closing in. Veins throbbed overhead, pulsing with thick, black ichor. The entire town, everything, everyone, had been nothing but fuel. A slow, methodical digestion spanning years, decades. She and Callum were the last ones left. Callum. He stood a few feet away, half human, half something else. His transformation was no longer subtle. His skin had peeled back in places, revealing dark plates of chitin, veins glowing with an eerie pulsing light. His spine was ridged with jagged protrusions, his fingers elongated into talons, his eyes black and too deep. Elira knew what she was looking at now. Not a monster, not a human, a weapon, one of the last of his kind, engineered to fight the Devourer. The people of her world had whispered about them in legends, in horrors, beings from an ancient human race, lost to time, built not to survive but to end. But Callum wasn't ready. His body was still fighting against itself, his breaths labored, torn between what he was and what he had tried so hard not to become. If he didn't finish changing, they would die here, or worse, become part of it. Elira forced herself up. Her skin burned where it had touched the Devourer's mass, small patches of her flesh already changing, shifting, absorbing the influence of whatever force ruled this place. There wasn't much time. The largest of the mouths, the core, was opening, layers of raw, glistening muscle peeling back, revealing something worse within. Teeth, rows and rows of them, endless, spiraling down into an abyss that wasn't just inside this creature, but somewhere else, some void beyond the reach of the living. A gate, not just a body. Elira felt something deep inside her twist, a thread of recognition, of horror. It wasn't just eating them, it was pulling them into something else, something worse than death. Callum roared, his voice no longer human. The transformation had taken hold. His back split open, jagged tendrils of dark metallic sinew erupting outward, his body now something that shouldn't exist. His chest cracked, revealing a core of pulsing light, a deep, searing glow that sent the Devourer recoiling, its walls writhing in response. The Devourer was afraid. Elira felt it. For the first time, it hesitated. It knew what Callum was now, and it feared him. Now, Elira. His voice was warped, layered, something more than human. Get clear. She didn't hesitate. She ran, leaping over the convulsing flesh beneath her, dodging snapping tendrils, feeling the Devourer's whispers clawing at her mind. It tried to hold her, to pull her down, but she fought. Every step, every breath was a battle against the weight of it. Callum lunged, his arms tore through the tendrils reaching for him, slicing through the living walls like wet paper. He moved faster than she had ever seen, his body now built for this. His eyes burned with something ancient, something that had been waiting, buried inside him, for centuries. The Devourer shrieked, thousands of mouths opening in unison, a sound that made the world itself tremble. Callum dove into the core. The explosion wasn't fire, it wasn't light. It was destruction itself, something pure, something absolute. The glow from Callum's body detonated, ripping through the Devourer like a wound torn into the very fabric of space. Flesh burned, peeled away, collapsing inward. The gate, the terrible, endless abyss in the creature's maw, imploded, dragged into itself, shriveling like a dying star. The Devourer screamed. The world collapsed. Elira was falling. The flesh beneath her cracked, ruptured, and for a moment she felt nothing. Then, silence. Elira opened her eyes. She was lying on cold earth. The town was gone. Nothing remained but a crater, a vast empty void where the Devourer had once been, stretching for miles. No bodies, no ruins, not even ash. It had been wiped clean. She forced herself up, her muscles screaming, her breath ragged. Callum, he stood in the center of the crater, his back to her, still alive, still changed. She approached slowly, her heart pounding. Callum? He turned. His eyes weren't human anymore. Not fully. There was still something left of him, of the man she knew, but his body had finished the transformation. His hands no longer held flesh, but something else. Something sharper, designed for war. His breath came slower, his skin humming with some unseen energy. He had become what he was meant to be, and there was no undoing it. She stopped a few feet away, suddenly unsure. His gaze flickered, something unreadable in his expression. Then he smiled, a small, tired, human smile. "It's over," he said, his voice low, steady. Elira swallowed, looking around at the emptiness that stretched for miles. Was it? The Devourer was gone, but she had felt it before, when it screamed. It was afraid, not because it had lost, but because it wasn't the only one. There were more, and somewhere in the void of space they were watching, waiting. Elira exhaled. They had survived this, but the fight wasn't over. It had only just begun.